Who is Chevreuse? Being the current captain of the Special Security and Surveillance Patrol in Fontaine, she has an interesting story. Hi guys, I'm Slick and this is the entire lore of Chevreuse. Make sure to hit the subscribe button if you enjoy learning about the lore of Genshin Impact.
I'm Chevreuse, captain of Fontaine's Special Security and Surveillance Patrol. You'll excuse me if I skip the pleasantries. Is there a case that needs my attention?
After an unfortunate turn of events in her childhood, she grew up in the Fleuve Cendré, if I'm pronouncing that right, the underground area beneath the court of Fontaine with a history of housing people that are not so law-abiding. But Chevreuse grew up with a strong sense of upholding the law. Her father, Donatello, wrong Donatello and wrong sewers. He was also a member of Fontaine's guard. Raising Chevreuse the best he could, he intended for her to be his successor. Later on, often putting her through difficult trials that were meant to frustrate her, which she always seemed to complete without much issue. In his mind, this showed him that she was even more suitable for the job than he was for upholding justice. But we'll talk more about her early life and her father's story later. As the current captain of Fontaine's Special Patrol, Chevreuse is unmatched at her job. She shares a strong bond with her subordinates and those who she works with. For example, she refuses to accept the idea that any of them would act outside of the law without being shown sufficient proof, and they all have a similar respect for her. And though she is amazing at her job, Chevreuse tends to be more lax than leaders of the other branches of Fontaine's law enforcement. And to better explain that, I want to explain first that the law enforcement of Fontaine has many different branches, but they're all under the umbrella of the Maison Gardenie, if I'm pronouncing that right. Chevreuse is captain of one of the branches, the Special Security and Surveillance Patrol. Members of law enforcement in general must undergo rigorous examinations and follow precise instructions. But the Special Security and Surveillance Patrol do things very differently from the other law enforcement agencies. Members are not required to use standardized weapons, and many of them choose to use muskets as a part of their arsenals due to Chevreuse's influence. They also don't have to wear uniforms outside of formal occasions, and many of them refuse to go on missions with Gardamex, which are the robot guards in Fontaine. Chevreuse has a particular dislike for Gardamex. She believes them to just be an obstacle who can get in the actual guard's way and block their bullets. They also have the potential to turn against anyone in an instant due to them being robots and easily hackable. She prefers doing things the old-fashioned way, with human interaction, without the need for new special robot technology. Many of the guards under her have agreed and adopted her sentiment, both as a show of respect for her and because she has valid points about the robots.
Although our organization belongs to the Maison Gardiennage, the Special Security and Surveillance Patrol makes little use of Gardamex. As for the reason, well, let's just say those cumbersome machines would only get in the way of our bullets.
And despite the Maison Gardenie not liking some of the Special Patrol's methods, for the sake of quick problem solving, they're usually willing to overlook the issues. But one thing that they refuse to overlook is Chevreuse's method and willingness to invite serious felons to participate in cases that she is handling as special consultants. Though Chevreuse is very clear that she only does this to catch worse criminals as soon as possible, many of her colleagues believe that relying on criminals to arrest criminals is an insult of the laws of Fontaine and all of law enforcement. They believe it lacks dignity and is humiliating. When Chevreuse is faced with questions about it, she has one general response. The greatest insult to the law is a criminal roaming free and unpunished. Dignity isn't worth the comparison of safety. She's willing to do anything, even sometimes stoop to unlawfulness in order for justice to prevail.
The Special Security and Surveillance Patrol deals with a whole host of heinous crimes and dangerous criminals. As such, the methods we employ to enforce the law can be a bit on the harsher side.
And despite upholding the law, she does occasionally stoop to doing some seemingly unlawful acts or turning a blind eye to some people. For example, she once bribed Emerald for information regarding a mysterious shooter, and she turns a blind eye to Chiori, throwing people out of her store and completely driving out business competitors in Fontaine. In her free time, Chevreuse can often be found reading books, particularly ones in which justice prevails over evil. She also has an unhealthy relationship with junk food, especially while she's at work. When she's off work, she considers junk food to be her worst enemy and highly dislikes uncooked food. Many members of Fontaine's patrol dislike some of the fearful sentiment taught to Fontaine children by their parents. Children are often told to behave or else the patrol will come and take them away. It's used as a way to get children to obey, even for things like eating snacks or getting bad grades. Even though it's clear to them as adults that the special patrol will never take unwarranted action, the people of Fontaine still tense up when they see Captain Chevreuse, mortally afraid that they might have done something wrong wrong without knowing. Though it's clear that they are there to fight crime, it's still hard to suppress the urge to tense up because of what they were told as children. Many patrol members see it as inappropriate for them to be feared, because in reality, they'd never drag anyone away, especially not someone who's not doing anything wrong. They exist to protect, not to be feared. But Chevreuse's response to them when it's brought up to her is maybe there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe the children will always remember the patrol's seemingly infamous reputation when they grow up. That way, maybe a day won't come when the patrol will actually have to come after someone. It'll make them think twice before committing a horrible crime. Fear, even if baseless, will help to keep them from doing anything wrong. In the court of Fontaine, many odd occurrences happen that often confuse outsiders and tourists. There's a lot of weird laws in Fontaine. For example, it's illegal for fruit tarts to be placed directly on unheated plates. Unfinished Fanta can't be placed intentionally in the middle of roads, and it's a legal requirement to trim your pet's claws. Violations of some of these weird laws can be hard to avoid, but Fontainians are familiar with them. If an offense of any law does happen, it's best to choose course of action based on who is sent to deal with the matter. If it's a member of staff, usually conversation can resolve the issue. If it's a uniformed administrator, all onlookers will have to sit through a very long-winded lecture. If it's an officer of the guard that appears, that means that anyone involved won't be getting away scot-free. In many cases, they'll have to pay fines. In this case, it's best to immediately clarify who you are if you're just an innocent bystander who's not involved. However, if it's Chevreuse that appears, that means that a really bad case is unfolding. Perhaps something violent, or with hostages that'll have to be handled with violence. In that case, it's best to evacuate the area with the instructions given to you by the special patrol. Though for some, curiosity may be tempting, it's best to not watch from a close distance. But there's no reason to feel unsafe. If Chevreuse is there, any hope of a criminal escaping is diminished to zero.
The Special Security and Surveillance Patrol is just one of the many branches of the Maison Gardiennage. We have a more daring way of doing things, and some in the Maison Gardiennage are under the impression that we don't exactly play by the rules. But I don't think the way the Special Patrol operates should be influenced by outside forces. The criminals we face aren't your everyday goody-goodies from the Palais Mermonia. When crimes are committed swiftly and without warning, like the sudden downpour of a rainstorm, we have to be able to respond just as fast.
When Chevreuse discusses her father with others, she always offers one simple evaluation. Donatello is an upstanding officer of the law. This is one of the only two impressions she has of her father from her childhood. During her childhood, her father was always busy, leaving in a rush in the mornings and returning exhausted late at night, hugging Chevreuse and her mother and apologizing for being so late. Sometimes he would return home very late, bringing his daughter sweet treats. Sadly, after already brushing her teeth, it was too late for her to have any more sugar. Her mother would allow her to have a bit though, since they were such rare treats, before bringing desserts and coffee to Donatello in his bedroom. During this time at night, he could normally be found facing a wall covered in pictures and thumbtacks, either staring at it blankly, pacing around the room, raising his fists in triumph, or pounding them on the table in defeat. Chevreuse was a witness to all of it, silently peeping in from behind the door. Sometimes she'd run into her father on the street, excitedly waving, only to get a slight smile before he returned to whatever task he was working on. Her father was an upright and good man. Her mother, her neighbors, and everyone they knew praised him. But one day, his colleagues, who always praised him, suddenly came knocking at the door. Her mother was at a loss as they came and left the home. Chevreuse stayed in her room, away from all the commotion. But she had guessed that somehow her father had become a sinner, like the ones he once pursued. She feared that he might even be banished to the fortress of Meripede. This became her second impression of her father, an upstanding sinner. Even the most well-versed of Fontaine citizens would struggle to explain to a child why a suspect who all evidence pointed to could not be convicted, why everyone maintained their silence as an innocent and upstanding officer of the law was falsely accused, and why so many witnesses to the crime refused to speak the truth, why her father must pay with his own reputation and future for justice to make an appearance, why the path to justice must be paved with crime. For Chevreuse, the most jarring of the changes after her father's false conviction was moving to the Fleuve Cendré. Apologies if I'm not pronouncing that right. Her and her mother sharing a narrow room, worse food, and losing contact with friends who now never spoke to her. That, and now her mother growing more ill and weak by the day. Her father's colleagues often visited in plainclothes, bringing gifts and news, speaking of how hard they were working on Donatello's appeal. Not just the guards in the special patrol, but several of the administrators who worked with them. And how, despite the fact that her father had broken the law to achieve justice, his sentence could not be shortened. It only made her mother worry more though. In order to take care of her mother, who was growing frail, Chevreuse didn't hesitate to take up burdens lessons that a child as young as her should never have to. And perhaps it was because the residents of the Floof Cendrée had heard about or been on the receiving end of her father's care. So many of their helping hands were extended to her. A kind shop owner gave her a job, and the next door neighbors often took care of her mother for her while she was gone. When the children learned that the child of a guard had come to live among them, they flocked to her, seeking her opinions on disputes among them. They saw it as a game, and soon Chevreuse would bring a stack of legal materials in a notebook, and began solving these disputes between the other children. But unlike the officers above ground, her judgments were executed under her supervision. At this time is when she began to learn to do her best to uphold justice.
The criminals I encounter aren't all cold-blooded killers and heartless villains. Most of them start off by making a small mistake, but are too afraid to own up to it. In their efforts to make up for it in secret, they end up getting sucked into a whirlpool of lies. Before they know it, they're in over their heads, and they're forced down the path of a criminal despite the best of intentions. There's this line by my favorite playwright that goes, "Lies are the soil in which the seeds of crime are sown." But he was arrested for plagiarism a few years later. Talk about dramatic irony, I suppose.
Donatello was exiled for breaking the law, leaking classified intelligence regarding a major case in order to gain interest from the press to assist in investigating the criminal he was after. He served his time in the fortress of Meripede, and Chevreuse continued growing up, the child of a sinner, and as such, she was unable to work for the Maison Gardenie, but she was able to seek fighting crime as a member of the Special Security and Surveillance Patrol, as her father did after serving his time. She was no longer a child and knew exactly what her father had done. Though he was at first uneasy about his daughter following in his footsteps, she had completed every bit of training that he prepared for her. She passed every single one of his rigorous trials, even those meant to frustrate her, even plunging into freezing cold winter seas. It was hard for Donatello to see her go through the trials he set, wanting to help his child and cradle her, but his willpower allowed him to watch instead of help. And she passed every single trial. He eventually saw that she was even more suited to uphold justice than him. She was stronger than him. As the captain of the Special Patrol at the time was hearing her case when she was ready to join them, she found herself explaining her statement over and over. But they only wanted to hear one thing from her: her agreement that her father was guilty of his crimes, and that the results of the hearing all those years ago were correct. Justice would make its appearance. Eventually they would let her in, and eventually she would become the best of all of them. Compared to the original version, the improved version of the Special Security and Surveillance Patrol's standard musket has a modified stock that better fits the human shoulders, as well as a longer barrel. Some specialized Type 2 muskets feature lots of other attachments, such as scopes, grenade launchers, and all types of melee weapons. Though Chevreuse, now the captain of the Special Patrol, worked to modify the firearms, she added several other requirements for her training regiments, stating that the reason for the Special Patrol is to capture criminals, not to walk around showing off your gun. Chevreuse has every member train in unarmed combat, as well as with different types of weapons. Thanks to the Type 2 musket, the amount of training has vastly increased. Chevreuse completed 100% of every training regiment, while some members of the patrol begged her for mercy in their training.
The musket is my favorite weapon. It's both powerful and threatening. Sometimes the latter trait is far more useful.
How did Chevreuse get her vision? She rarely discusses how she did on her own accord. To others, she says that the reason she doesn't talk about it is because the authority and prestige of the Special Patrol comes from law and justice. Focusing on visions will only create misunderstanding, so it's better to not discuss it. But those who are close to her know that her vision is much more of a heavy burden to her.
My vision is certainly an integral part of the way I execute my duties. For instance, my musket has never had a major malfunction since I received my vision. I'd say a captain who wields a musket and a vision is more than enough to scare off a few cowardly criminals.
After joining the Special Patrol, she used her talent and perseverance to complete all kinds of intense training programs, memorizing every rule, regulation, and standard for operations. Without question, she was quickly first in her class. Her pursuit of justice was admired by her peers, but the officer in charge of them, Vice Captain Grisetti, disagreed. He would never pick Chevreuse for field missions. Her and the other members could only guess why. Was it to protect her? She was the daughter of Donatello, one of his closest friends. He had helped take care of her during her father's time in prison, and she had grown close with him as a child, even seeing him as an uncle. Maybe he was planning to take her on some sort of more important job. Chevreuse tried not to think about it much, but after the 6th time of being excluded from missions, she couldn't bear it any longer not to ask why. His only response was, "You're not ready." He instructed her to fix her conception of justice, and that if her understanding of it was limited to an eye-for-an-eye approach, it was best for her to leave. At the time, Chevreuse had not yet grasped the full concept of justice, and she didn't know when she would be ready. Soon after though, Grisetti found himself short-handed during an urgent mission hunting down a gang of criminals. With no choice, he finally called on Chevreuse, but he repeatedly warned her not to act without his permission, to follow orders and to stay close. Soon after they headed out, closing off every possible route that the gang of criminals could take. Chevreuse and Grisetti concealed themselves in some bushes and waited. After some time, the criminals had not appeared. The two of them began to think that their intelligence was mistaken. As they were preparing to leave, a shot rang out from a hidden position, and Grisetti was struck. Almost instantly, Chevreuse counterattacked, using the criminal's muzzle flash in the darkness as a guide, and hit them with a single precise bullet. But sadly, her uncle Grisetti's wound had quickly been fatal. Now, only her and the killer remained. The howling wind and the torrential downpour could conceal the sound of another gunshot, and the special patrol might not look too closely in the case of how this killer who murdered one of their colleagues had been shot dead. She wanted to carry out justice, and the criminal was right in front of her. She lifted her musket, aimed right between his eyes, but then lowered her gun. The special patrol speaks only in the name of justice, and true justice can only be decided by the courts. Perhaps this is what Grisetti meant, and this is what it meant to be a member of the special patrol. She shouted to the criminal that they were under arrest. No sooner had she finished speaking, the criminal began to hobble away, attempting to flee. With the crack of a musket, the man was struck in his right leg. He cried out in agony as the other members of the special patrol had rushed over. The justice of the law is carried out by the courts, but as for Chevreuse's personal justice, that was carried out by her alone. As she finally completely lowered her musket, she had yet to notice a pyrovision was now hanging from its stock. In the horrible wind and rain, its glow was not readily apparent, much like justice yet to be revealed, pale and dark.